Judges ready? What is the EU? That was the question most Googled after the referendum that cut all ties between the UK and EU. The day after, ladies and gentlemen, on our side of the House, by actually putting responsibility on the electorate, we make sure that they ask that question the day before. We believe an uninformed electorate is inherently threatening the very core of democracy. Fundamentally, proud to propose today's motion, which reads, this House believes the voters should have to pass a basic test of political general knowledge before they are allowed to vote. And we have two burdens for you on Team Denmark today. First of all, this is principally justified due to the inherent harm on an uninformed electorate to the core idea of democracy. And secondly, this will lead to better policies. We're going to do this by advancing a three-point case. First of all, why it's democratically illegitimate not to have this test. Secondly, the benefits of an informed electorate. And thirdly, my partner Clara is going to talk to you about how we're going to have fewer lies in campaigns. But moving on to the model and some criteria for this debate. First of all, we'll talk about Western liberal democracies. We will implement this test in the general elections, referenda, plebiscites, etc. The kind of test we were talking about would be like executed by an independent body such as international electoral observers. The kind of questions we're talking about is stuff like what do parties stand for, which candidate wants the highest welfare benefits, etc. But also general things about, for instance, current issues such as how much money goes to the EU from the UK, etc. Now, we say that this would be a 30-minute test. If you get the majority correct, you would have your ballot. Now, we say that you can begin coming in for this test a month before the referendum or the election, and you can take the test as many times as it needs to pass. The important thing is that you eventually pass the test, right? Now, we will also supplement this motion by sending out informative material in order to read up and pass the test. Generally, we think this is comparable to citizenship tests, and we need team opposition to prove to us why we should expect this kind of knowledge from newcomers to our countries, but not the average member of the electorate. They need to address this in their next speech. Now, moving to my first constructive point about why it's democratically legitimate not to have these kind of basic tests that we're proposing. Our thesis at this point is that an uninformed electorate fundamentally defeats the purpose of democracy for the individual and on a societal level. First of all, let's talk about the legitimacy of voters. Here I'm going to ask the question, what is a vote? We see a vote as a way for you as an individual to express your opinion, thus actually say what you believe is needed to improve your station in society and in life. We see that why we have all these kind of votes is that we get the aggregate sum of every voting, which means we get this democratic equilibrium, because it's like the aggregate sum of what everyone thinks society should be. Now, when do we take your vote away from you? Well, we see we don't allow people below the age of 18 in many countries to vote, and we take the vote away if you're mentally disabled. That's inherently because you're not able to fulfill the criteria.
Sir!
No thank you, Team America, because you're not rational. You're not able to actually identify, no thank you, what you need in order to improve the station of your life. That means you're inherently making an uninformed decision, which defeats the purpose of democracy in terms of rationality, no thank you. We're given the example of the Danish People Party in Denmark, an anti-immigrant party, who basically based their campaign on this idea of anti-immigrant sentiment. We see that people only focused on this, not really knowing what their actual economic policies were. When they get into government, they cut welfare benefits extraordinarily, no thank you, inherently defeating the self-interest of the voters who actually support them in the campaign. See, this is very harmful since they're not actually rational.
Sir.
No thank you. Moving on to this idea about duties of a citizen. Because you see you derive many benefits from living in a democracy. You get prosperity, you get peace, etc. That means you have a moral obligation to actually give back to this democratic system that is inherently beneficial to you.
Sir.
As I just explained to you, no thank you. We'll get the aggregate sum, the best possible compromise, when everyone acts in the rational interest of their own.
Sir.
That means, no thank you, have an inherent obligation to stay informed, to protect us. But furthermore, we say that it's inherently justified for the state to install this kind of preventive measures, such as we're proposing today, because an informed electorate can be incredibly harmful. I'm sorry guys, but Donald Trump, he said no thank you. He has the potential to undermine all the democratic institutions, which is inherently harmful. We also give the example of the Polish party Law and Justice. Once they get into government, they're also anti-immigrant, by the way. They undermine the constitutional courts. They're undermining, no thank you, the very fabric of which democracy will went into. That means, because democracy has to be self-protecting, they are justified in trying to create this electorate. Before we continue, one of you.
So you're saying that people who are voting for Donald Trump are uninformed. You have constitutional lawyers doing these things, and they're smart people. We say the reason is not because they're uninformed, but because they're racist or because they're sexist.
Okay. Well, we argue there's still going to be people voting for Donald Trump. By the way, I'm sorry about that. I'm going to explain in my second point as to why we even create more responsible populist candidates and populist parties. Because on our side of the house, we're going to have informed populists. Very important in that regard. Moving on to this idea, the second construction point, about benefits from an informed electorate. First of all, I'm going to outline why our mechanism will work. Well, we see people generally care about their inherent rights to voice out their opinions and maximise their utility and the station of life in society. That means that if the prerequisite for activating that right is to be informed, is to do well on this test, we believe that this mechanism will function as an incentive to do so. Now, let's look at this idea of populist parties. Because, first of all, the problem we identify in the status quo is populist parties across Western Europe, it's Donald Trump, it's Brexit, etc. Basically, single-issue voting. Meaning that they only focus their campaign on the idea of sovereignty, on the idea of refugees,
Sir?
no thank you, like immigrants, etc. How do we change this negative thing right in the status quo? Well, because now you have to answer questions about the general stances of the parties. You have to answer, what is Front National's economic policy? What is Donald Trump's view on abortion? No thank you. We see this is very, very important, because this is going to lead to either two scenarios. Either you're still going to vote for this populist candidate, but you're going to be more informed. This leads to the benefit of the populist parties actually becoming more responsible, because now they're aware of people actually looking into the political programs, not simply just listening to Boris Johnson say, take back our country in the media. No thank you. Very important in that regard. But we also see there's going to be the people who like the idea of sovereignty, but when they actually go in and examine the very core policies, for instance of the Danish People Party in terms of welfare benefits, they're going to change their minds. This is also very important, because now they can make a rational decision that's also aligned with their inherent interest in a democracy. Sure.
Someone who's dyslexic in the status quo is mentally retarded to you, but they can still vote. In your world, because they're mentally disabled, now a dyslexic person can't even vote for a president.
Okay, the dyslexic point is quite outside of the spectrum of this debate. We can get support for the dyslexic people as well. There's important distinctions to be made about people who simply cannot read and people who choose not to do so, because that is inherently irrational and comparable to mentally disabled people in our regard. Now, okay, so because we're inherently making sure that you now create awareness about the general stance of the parties, we create better politics. But moving on to this idea about how we also create better policies in general, because as a result of our mechanism, people are constantly going to be more aware about political issues. That means they're going to be better at identifying the core issues that they care about and that they need to improve their station of life. That means that they're now more able to voice out their opinions and vocalize their concerns to the politicians. That means that on our side of the house, we get a representative democracy that is more in touch with the electorate, the very core principle of what democracy should be about. That means that now when people actually go out and read about stuff, they're that much more likely to call their congressmen about specific issues, because now we have created democratic awareness. Fundamentally, because we believe that on the long term, an uninformed electorate undermines the democracy that so many generations have fought for, have died for, we believe this policy is absolutely detrimental. Thank you.
Time is 8 minutes and 5 seconds.
I'd now like to call Milan to give his speech.
Uninformed voters aren't just lazy, like the proposition tells you in today's debate. We thought that was a very offensive assertion to base their case off of, because at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, structural barriers caused by the state are the things that disenfranchise people and prevent them from being informed in the first place. We think when you allow the state to penalize people for its own faults, for things like being dyslexic, when 700 million people in the world lack primary education, we thought that was an awfully offensive stance to base their case off of in today's debate. Because at the end of the day, it's the opposition in today's debate who stands for the people who are the most disadvantaged in society and who stand for them getting a voice from the electorate in today's debate. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to respond to some of the matter we heard from the proposition team. Secondly, I'm going to present some issues on framing. And finally, I'm going to outline our first 2 substantive arguments. Firstly, that their policy harms the principle of democratic legitimacy, and secondly, that their policy disenfranchises the disadvantaged. But first, let's begin with what we heard from the proposition. Now let's start off on their motto. We think there's a couple of issues with this, and I'm just going to breeze through it. First off, we think their questions are far too vague for actually being a political competency test. When they say we're actually just going to look at, well, which candidate talks about welfare benefits, we're not actually getting a picture of what an informed electorate is. Secondly, when you can take the test as many times as you want, people are just going to memorize the test. They're not actually going to learn anything, which is the only place the prop gets their impacts from. Thirdly, their primary impact in today's debate is from education. They talk about informative material here. We think all of those things can happen under our side of the house, promoting education, putting in better policies so people are better voters, without adding another hoop for people to jump through, which we not only think practically disenfranchises people, but is also principally opposed to the concept of democracy. Going over their first argument where they talk about democratic legitimacy. First off, they make the offensive claim that a mentally disabled man can't vote. We think this is absurd when in the status quo, these people are the ones who are most disenfranchised in society, and they have the ability to vote because they need to help themselves through policy changes. Then they say that individuals don't know what they need if they don't pass this competency test. We think this is an absurd assertion. I don't need to know which candidate talks about welfare benefits if I need a stoplight on my street, if I need material change in my own community, right? Overall broad political knowledge isn't beneficial to that notion. Then they talk about you get the best outcome because you hear all voices. We think this isn't necessarily true because it's not just like it's not like those people who can't vote under their side of the house can suddenly get educated and then vote, right? There's structural barriers in place, like poor education, like a lack of infrastructure, that prevent them from suddenly learning and then taking the test, right? So under their side of the house, this is what happens. People who vote for Donald Trump in the status quo aren't all those people who are just uninformed in the first place, right? There are plenty of rich, conservative people who vote for people like Marianne Le Pen, like Donald Trump, not because they're uneducated, but because they think that's the correct pathway, and their side doesn't solve for these kinds of things. In fact, they just leave it the same. Then go into their second argument, where they talk about the practical impacts here. They say still answering questions essentially adds to education. We think, again, you can increase education without adding this principled and practical harm. If that's their only advantage in today's debate, it can still happen without the harms of their model. But then they say 2 scenarios happen. Firstly, people are still going to vote for the same people, but then they're just more informed. If they're still voting for the same people, and the same policy changes are still occurring, there's really no impact on their side of the house. Everything stays the same. But the second issue, they say, is people are suddenly going to shift their votes now. We think this is an absurd assumption when in the UK and in the US, populist movements take root in people who aren't just uneducated, but who have money and who are educated. Go.
Would you ban jury duty?
We think that's not the focus of today's debate, right? We're talking about whether or not people should take a competency test in order to vote. That's not a principled clash. Now onto the opposition's first argument on the principle of democratic legitimacy. 3 layers of analysis for you here. Firstly, on accountability. Intrinsic to any democracy is the ability for one individual to vote for the policies that affect them. This idea of accountability, the bond between the individual and the government, is what any democracy is foundationally based on. This is what happens in the proposition world. You undermine that principal foundation because now you have other people who are not that individual voting for what occurs to that individual. We think when one person can no longer determine what policies affect them because they are unable to vote, that principally damages accountability, which is the foundation of a democracy. Second layer of analysis here, the state in most cases is responsible for a lack of basic political knowledge. The reason people lack knowledge in the vast majority of cases is because the state was inadequate in providing that in the first place. This means things like poor state education, which means people can't actually gain the type of political competency necessary to pass the test, or even a lack of education. This also means things like a lack of infrastructure, like roads, so people can get to school in the first place in order to gain the necessary education to pass this test. We think at that point, the state has failed in providing adequate means for the individual to be educated, so they don't have a right to take away that individual's voice just because of their own failure, right? That undermines the concept of democracy on the whole. The third layer of analysis here is on value judgments, because we think political decisions rarely actually benefit from the political knowledge they're talking about. There's no optimal outcome when you're preferring one candidate over another. Whatever personally is valuable to an individual is what they ought to vote on, right? So when I'm deciding between a candidate or another candidate, it's not necessarily what creates the best outcome for society, it's what's personally good for me, that value judgment. Conversely, if I want a traffic light in my own basic community, or if I want to improve structural racism in my own community, I don't need basic political competency to do that. That's something that's valuable to me. Voting is an intrinsic right that comes from our personal claim to make value judgments in democracy. The problem is, the proposition turns this into a utilitarian right that's only beneficial insofar as it benefits the community. This undermines the idea of individualism, which is at the heart of a democracy on the whole. Second argument on disenfranchising the disadvantaged. The people who lack basic political knowledge are often those who are already the most marginalized in society. People without education, I'll take you in a second, people who have suffered from institutional disenfranchisement, and people who are like minorities who have been systematically discriminated against. These people are the ones who can't pass their test, not those who are simply lazy. Go ahead.
Would you ban children voting?
We think that's not the point of today's debate. If you're under 18 in most states, you can't already vote. That's not the clash of today's debate. It's about those who are disenfranchised, whether they are lazy or not, like the Prop 24. So here's the problem. We think when 700 million people around the world lack primary education, this isn't only a small slice of society, this is a huge majority of them. People vote in their own interest to change their lives, right? That's the point of voting. So we say people who, if these voices are no longer heard, these people who are disadvantaged no longer have anyone voicing for their own state, right? No one's going to promote the ability of the disadvantaged to live better if the disadvantaged can't vote, right? These are also the people who are affected the most by policies, right? Because if you pass a policy to help someone who's in privilege, it's not going to help them as much as if you pass a policy to help someone who's systematically disenfranchised. This is the marginal utility of policymaking. The problem is, when you look to a country like India and there's overcrowding so that no one can get into public school, these individuals may not be able to read or write, but they know they don't want to vote for a candidate like Narendra Modi who systematically disenfranchises people in India, right? We don't think all this does is disenfranchise the people who are disadvantaged in the first place. But you can also look to minorities, right? These minorities, such as in the United States or in Asia, often live in poorer areas. This means you will have noisy testing sites. This means you don't have access to tutoring because you're in poorer areas. And on the most basic level, it means you're going to be hungry on test day, so you can't pass the test, right? We think all this does is disenfranchise the people who don't have the ability to pass the test in the first place and who can't simply get the education because they're not lazy, like the prop says. At the end of today's debate, the clash is pretty simple. People who can't pass this test aren't just lazy, there's structural barriers in place. And we shouldn't undermine democracy and penalize those who are most disadvantaged when we can just acquire the education they talk about through other, less reprehensible means. Honor to oppose.
Thank you, Milan, for your speech.
Speaking time was 8 minutes and 4 seconds.
Welcome, second speaker of Denmark, Clara.
Do we have a problem with people voting for Donald Trump? Not at all. Do we have a problem with poor people voting for Donald Trump, thinking he's going to make their lives better by decreasing taxes without this actually being his policy? Definitely. That's why we continue to propose on our side of the house. Firstly, I'm going to clear a grossly mischaracterized idea of a model and what this debate should actually be about. Then I'm going to rebut things, and I'm going to bring back what Emile told you, which was never truly engaged with, and analyze why there was a huge strategic flaw from team opposition. And lastly, I'm going to engage with an argument which is going to give Denmark today's win. Let me now get into, firstly, a few strategic mistakes which they made. They refused to answer the two stance POIs which we made. The first of which was jury duty. Why was it important that they took a stance on this? Because we tell you that already we make citizens do certain things so they can get the societal benefit. We think these are things such as paying taxes. We think this extra tax is just another layer of that to make sure that citizens pay back to society, because only then can society begin to actually benefit them in terms of better policies. Something you didn't respond to. The second thing they never responded to was, would we let kids vote? They said the reason why we do not let kids vote in the status quo is not because these are not impacted. Kids are just as impacted as the rest of them in terms of education. It is because kids are simply not aware of what each and every one of these politicians stand for. That is why it is crucial that we continue to make sure we have an electorate that is educated insofar they can vote for the policies which best benefit themselves. That is strategic mistakes they have to play out in the next weeks. They can't just dismiss us as they have tried to. So let's just talk a little bit about our model. Okay, so they told us, oh, you know what, it's not going to help anything. People are just going to go in there and memorize the answers. Comparatively, that's actually kind of what we want. We want people to memorize the answers. We want people to know which kind of candidate is going to increase public health care, which candidate is going to have more gun control. We don't think this actually cares. Then they had this huge kind of, oh, what if people can't read? What if people can't access this sort of information? We told you very clearly that we will send out this information, but you know what? Just for the heck of it, let's have a seminar right before everyone that can't read or didn't get the information, so we can tell them what each and one of these politicians is going to vote for. We don't think this is the heart of this debate. Literally, the only contingent little thing that they have is with our model, and let's just go ahead and improve it, because this is not inherent to our side of the house. Let's engage, no thank you, with what he actually did tell us. Essentially, he kept on bringing for this gross mischaracterization of people in WLBs, where we set this point, can't get access to education. These people are hungry and testing. Mr. Speaker, we don't think this test is going to be very difficult. We think this is something, we think people in general in these LDs, no thank you, have access to education. Let's just actually deal with the heart of this case, which never really clearly came forward, which is this idea of poor people being disenfranchised. Why is that far better on our side of the house? Because as he pointed out to you, the people that don't vote today, people with poor, no thank you list, we typically perceive as very, lazy. Why is that important in today's debate? When a politician thinks that you are lazy, I will not cater to you because I cannot get your vote. When we have to begin, no thank you, to go ahead and look at the great map. I see that there's a huge population here that did not actually, answer the task correctly. I'm going to know that this is a specific group which I can cater my policies to. I will have an inherent incentive to go ahead and cater to these people to make them more educated, so that they can then later, no thank you, go ahead and vote for me. This never happens on the side of the opposition. We think this is very important in today's debate. We think that lastly, no thank you, then they began to have some sort of weird access to what Emile's essentially told you. They had this entire point on, oh, you know what, you don't actually need overall broad and knowledge to make these sort of decisions. But we actually tell you, Mr. Speaker, that you really, really, really do, because you need to know which sort of politician that can make the life the very best for you. We think we would just kind of rebuild and give some more analysis to Emile's point, which is this idea of better policies. We give you the example of Brazil. Dilma Rousseff right now hands out money to every single poor person that lives within the northern region if their income level is below a certain thing. What she does not tell you when she blasts out this thing is that these money are being directly taken from the public healthcare system, from the public education system. In this way, these poor people are actually being further disenfranchised without actually knowing that this is happening. Why is that very important in today's debate? Because we don't actually care whether or not you vote for Dilma Rousseff or not, but we care about you knowing what the impacts of the policies she's posing upon you are. That is why we need you to be able to make this sort of informed decision, so you can decide yourself, is it good or bad for me if I have left public health care, even though I'll have more money? Only informed decisions ever legitimate. The principle which Emile told you, which they never engaged with, I'll get into this before I take this POI.
If they still vote for the same candidate, what does your model change? Yes, they're more informed, but they still vote for the same person.
Well, okay, great. Thank you for getting into that. That's my principal point. Yes, but at least we can now take this vote seriously. We gave you very structural analysis and why we need rational voters to go ahead and make this sort of decision. But we actually don't think this is where proposition wins today's debate, because on both sides of the house, these rational voters could go ahead and vote. We think where we take today's debate is these uninformed voters that make the wrong decisions for things that do not inherently benefit them, because they're simply being misinformed, which will be my third argument. Why is it important and like a huge strategic flaw that they never take down this like direct principle of democracy? Because we can never ever have a legitimate democracy if we do not believe that the citizens are voting in favor of themselves. That means that every single decision this government is making is not legitimate because the policies that are informing might not be in favor of the citizens. We told you very clearly that we need to have this sort of extra level of checks and balances within these citizens. We only have that when we begin to actually then have rational decisions, and also, last thing we never engage with, no thank you, is the idea of holding politicians, populists responsible. We think this stands clear on its own. Let me get into the third and final argument. I would encourage the entire opposition to listen very clearly. What happens in today's book is that we have more lying, my third argument. Essentially, what we tell is what's happening is that these politicians in our world is going to want to see their voters pass. Why is that important? Because right now they inherently rely on paper. We think Boris Johnson goes out and maybe tells you that there's 109 laws for pillows in the EU. Why is that really bad? Because when the politicians have a direct incentive to misinform you in order to get their policies through, then we see less legitimate policies being going through. We think this directly and actively harms the entire population. Essentially what they'll now have to do is go ahead and alter their campaign so you are actively aware of the policies which they're going through, which means that we are endlessly leading to more informed voters that don't vote no to Brexit because they think there are laws, but vote yes to Brexit because they think it's inherently better for England. That is the only way where we can actually legitimize the decision. But let's now get into the third, the second subject, which is actually far more important, which is this idea of politicians right now have a huge incentive to just throw mud at one another. We give you an example of 2011, where the NRA headsman and Sarah Palin goes out and tells you Obama wants to take away your guns. Why is that important? Because we think a lot of people that might have benefited from Obama's policies go ahead and were very disenfranchised by this idea, deterred by this. Why is that important? First of all, because this was factually untrue. The Secretary of Thank You Policy group that did this sort of exercise of which politicians better or worse for guns, examined all of these different relations, and you got a score based on how pro you were to guns. Obama literally scored an F, being he's the worst possible thing, meaning that he's not actually creating any drastic change within guns. But why is this important? Because right now we're going ahead and making sure there's no incentive to throw mud at the other candidate. Because you as a politician, and this is where we win today's debate, there's a direct waste of money in informing your voters upon the other candidate and his lies. Because if you tell your voters that this candidate has policies that he does not have, then the voter is going to go into the test, they're going to fail the test because you misinformed them, and that way they're not going to pass, meaning you will never ever get your vote. That is how proposition wins today's debate. Because we begin to limit the misinformation, there's a direct incentive to happen in the status quo. We think it is very important that we no longer have people such as various people going out there and saying, oh, these sort of fallacious things about the other politicians, because this distorts what the general debate should really be about. We think we're never ever going to be able to get the general policies which we want. What have proposition told you today? We've told you it is illegitimate to say that an uninformed electorate is handling everything rationally. We think poor people don't necessarily know what is best for them. We make sure that they do. We make sure they vote in the favours of this. And we have told you that this is the only way we'll begin to get better policies. Beg to propose.
Thank you for everyone's speech.
Speaking time was 8 minutes and 18 seconds.
Please welcome this second speaker of the opposition.
team government's entire case is a contradiction. Either they want to change the outcome of people's voting by influencing the way in which they approach elections, which is principally bad for democracy, so they would like people to actually change their opinions, or they want people to continue voting the way they would, and their entire third argument and all the impacts that they're gaining off of education and new policies go away completely. They need to sort that out before their next speech in order to have any chance for coming back. In this speech, I'm going to do two things. First, I'm going to go down and talk about Team Proposition's case some more. After that, build up what Millen brought you in his first speech. And then after that, the third argument, that institutional discrimination actually precludes the ability for certain individuals to vote. But let's go down and talk about Team Government's case. First, on the model. In the last speech, their second speaker brings up this idea of how we can talk about jury duty, so therefore the model is a big issue. One, we say that things like taxation, things that they talk about, are a consensual agreement we enter into when we go into the state. But things like voting are intrinsic rights that we get just by simply being in the, living in society. Two, even if you don't buy that, we say that things like juries in the United States, for example, are discriminatory because we see higher rates of black individuals getting struck from them, people in power using their ability to skew the outcomes of certain policies. Additionally, on the model, what we tell you is the idea that if it's quote-unquote not that difficult, like their last speaker says, doesn't that undermine this monumentous harm that they're trying to tell you about how we have this crazy uninformed electorate that has no idea what they're going to do? But the last speaker says that it's quote not that difficult. Please sort that out in your next speech. On to the proposition case. First, they tell you why it's democratically legitimate to do these things. They say we have a quote-unquote uninformed electorate, and they say that the reason we have this is because people don't know what's happening. The principal justification they give you for this is that people have a moral obligation to give back to the state if they're trying to participate in democracy by being informed. Okay, the response we give you is, first of all, if the state is restricting people's rights, i.e. people with disabilities now in the status quo are not at the benefit of the state, doesn't the converse burden apply? That the state has an obligation to cater policies and cater the way in which they do voting towards those people, not do things like say no people with disabilities are going to be able to show up. Two, when they talk about how people with disabilities can't vote, and then they use the fact that children can't vote, isn't that equating people with disabilities to having the mental capacity of a child? That's offensive at best to not engaging with the material that we're bringing you on our side of the house. I'd expect more out of our friends from Team Denmark. Additionally, what they say is that, we don't want people voting for Donald Trump because that's bad. A, contradiction, because they say we're not trying to sway the influence, we're just trying to educate people. Okay, then why don't you want them voting for Donald Trump? Two, we say that people can be educated and have degrees from Harvard, for example, and still vote for Donald Trump. They could probably still pass a basic test about what checks and balances are or what candidate says what. We say the reason that people vote for politicians like Donald Trump is because they're racist or because they're sexist, not because they're uninformed about the way political systems work. What we tell you conversely is that voting is an intrinsic principle to democracy, and I'll take you in a second, and that even if my vote, for example, doesn't affect the policy, the fact that I have that ability to actually interact in democracy is principally better. Go.
Do you believe that an uninformed voter is able to make better decisions for himself when he knows what policies each party stands
so here's what I don't understand. The implication of that argument is that the voter doesn't know what's best for them. That's patronizing at best to say that, you don't know what the best policy is for you, so we're going to take state, litigated responses to teach you how to vote. But at the same time, you don't care if people are voting differently. This makes no sense. The second argument that they're telling you about is the incentive to vote, the pragmatic harms. The only principal justification they give you for this is that we don't want people voting on single issues. Okay, if I want to vote for Hillary Clinton, for example, strictly based on the fact that she's a woman, that's principally illegitimate under their side of the house. I say we ought to afford voters the autonomy to make these decisions for themselves. Secondly, they say that we're going to get better education and better policies. Again, a contradiction if we're trying to change the way that policies are happening, if we're just trying to educate people. And this brings us nicely onto Team Opposition's side of the house. to rebuild up our material that Millen gives you. I talk a lot about the democratic legitimacy points, the idea of accountability, state failure. We say that if the root cause of people not being able to pass tests is because the state has not fulfilled their obligation to educate people properly, the fact that we're slapping like a band-aid solution of take this test and somehow it's going to get better doesn't address the root cause of the problem. On our side of the house, we say that you can do things like improve the education system on a state level without the harms associated with having this mandated test that would actually exclude people from that. Our second argument is the idea of discrimination in the voting system. This clashes directly with their last argument as well. What we tell you is that they turn something that's an intrinsic right, i.e. the ability to vote, into something that's a utilitarian right, meaning that voting is only good if it creates the most utility for the vast majority of people. But the problem with that is when we cater to the needs of the majority, there's always a minority that's intrinsically oppressed in that situation. We're going to say that that's principally bad. One, because you're not catering to the most marginalized people. Two, because you're not informing policies that are actually going to affect people that need it in the status quo. When Millen talks to you about access, he says things like, if there's some kind of trade-off because of my arbitrary social location, i.e. I can't put enough time into studying because I have to take care of my siblings or I have to work 2 jobs, therefore I'm not as educated onto how the state works, I still probably know if I don't want people, like policies happening, even if there is that trade-off in my personal life. Like their model and their approach towards the way in which people should vote does not take into account the systemic disadvantages that people are at in the status quo, and the way in which just saying we need like utility to maximize utility for voting doesn't like take into account the historical intricacies of what they're saying. Their third argument is this idea of like accountability in campaigning. What we tell you is this is basically like puts them in a really bad problem. So either we want politicians to like go out and actively preach to people and tell them what they should be voting, which would imply that we're informing the way they're doing their decisions, or we simply just want to like uphold the principle of democracy and not change people's voting, or like and just have them be educated. Which is this? This puts them like in a position that's like contradictory. And this brings us into the third argument, which is the idea of how like policies like this in the past have been historically used to marginalize people. They ensure that the test is created on their side of the house, but they cannot ensure that it won't be weaponized by the state as a means of like excluding people. A, historical analysis. We say that they're using the informed decision making as a justification for the test. Under their side of the house, the on misinformed voters is just a euphemism for the people I don't want voting on my policies. Look to the United States, for example, in the Jim Crow laws. We say that the state enacted these as a way of excluding black people from society because they did not believe that they had the ability to vote or were able to do this, and therefore they designed these tests as a means of excluding them from a democratic system, which they had equal access to. We additionally see this in Nicaragua, when the Sandinistas will only issue government identification and government forms to the people in the community that they want to vote, but they don't give that to the people who dissent against them, and that actually creates more systemic problems, and it creates an uneven playing field. The second piece of material underneath this is the impact. They say that things are going to get better. If they make the status quo worse under their world, because certain people are now not voting, that's a reason to vote for the opposition. We're telling you that people should have the right to vote, even if they cannot pass the test, which they cannot ensure won't be weaponized by the state. Because we are more principally in support of democracy, we urge an opposition ballot. Thank you.
Speaking time was 8 minutes and 50.
Please welcome Andrea, third speaker of Queen's opposition.
Our judge is ready. there are people who vote for Donald Trump and think that he is a completely legitimate candidate. But we welcome those voters to actually go vote for Donald Trump. We don't want to force those voters to vote for some other candidate. But what we do want is for those voters to actually know who they're voting for and what kind of referendum they're voting for. We think that is the crucial difference that differentiates our two sides today. We think that the people we are changing on the hand are two actors. We think that firstly, there's those people who buy into the lies we saw at Brexit about sovereignty and how many millions of pounds we spent on the EU. That's the people who don't necessarily oppose any kind of information, but just don't really know, right? We think that those people, when they take this test and see what's intrinsically the EU, what does it contain, and what does I, as a part of Great Britain, actually get out of it, and what kind of policies do they implement? We think that when they do that, right, they'll be more informed in order to actually vote for Brexit, right? And maybe they'll think even twice before they go out and vote for the lies that we saw with Nigel Farage, etc. Like, do that. We think those are the ones who we are informed. So instead of asking what is the EU after Brexit, right, we want to ask them beforehand so we don't have a decision that's going to harm a country decades from now. We think the second actor we're going to win on today is the person who can pass the test, whether because they're not educated enough, etc. We win on this actor because of two reasons. Firstly, because we gave you the inherent analysis of how parties now have an inherent interest and incentive to actually get those voters past the bar. That is to say that now the parties will actually not lie as much anymore, as we proved in our third argument, but secondly also that will inform them to a greater extent, right? We think this is inherently good to have those kind of voters, right? We think that the second one is, but this is the clear and very important thing as well. We think that the whole thing about are people just dumb and lazy, or are people just are people under these structural barriers, right? We think that in the status quo, yes, there is a tendency to people saying that those who don't vote, those are dumb and lazy. But we think that we don't know that when they don't go out and vote, and we see there's a low voter turnout in some area. What we can see in that area now is that they cannot pass that test, right? When they can't pass that test, we know that it's a structural problem, right? And we can see that from the government side of that they're going to be able to actually address these structural problems once we implement this test. So actually, because due to two things, we win that actor as well. Before going into my themes, right, I'm going to do 3 clarifications. Firstly, the whole third point about it being biased is simply not true. Stated directly that it's going to be an independent body that's going to facilitate this task. Secondly, we're not going to force people to vote for other candidates than Donald Trump, even though we might personally think that. But thirdly, right, we say that the test is not going to be a super hard test that we can't even pass. It's going to be a test that's going to ask questions about what is the EU and what policies do they implement. We did have relatively easy questions, but even though they cannot pass them, we've proven why we win on those as well.
Sir.
2 themes. Firstly, democracy, and secondly, how do we get better policies? No, thank you, sir. We go into the first one and look at democracy, right? Here we make the very clear analysis in Emil's speech about how the vote is supposed to express your opinion. But what is happening in the status quo? We said that people who cannot pass this kind of test, they cannot pass it because they don't know enough about the issue. But when you don't know enough about the issue, right, we think that essentially you cannot express your opinion because your opinion has to be based off of those kind of knowledge, right? So actually, you're not expressing your issue when you can't pass the test. That's what we want to help people with, and that's why we think we're principally justified in implementing these sorts of tests. Their response, well, what about the mentally disadvantaged, right? Now they can't vote. But we think that there's a reason for that. We think it's because they don't know what they're voting for under their own logic, right? Because they don't necessarily know what the interests are of policies, right? And that's under their own logic as well. They have to concede to that. But secondly, if there are people who cannot read, etc., we accommodate for that on our side with different seminars, etc., as we have. But thirdly, right, they make this kind of like case tension by firstly saying that they don't know enough to pass this test, right? This is their assumption. But secondly, they say that these people know enough to know what will advance their position in society. So what do you want to frame these people as? Someone who can pass the test or someone who can't? They need to take a stance. But thirdly, right, we think that we gave you the analysis of how you have the duty to stay informed. They didn't respond. Their principal analysis that it's the state's fault, so therefore it's illegitimate, right? We think that firstly, it's not necessarily the government, the status quo, that is responsible for the systematic oppression. Yes, there has been, right? So think that no, that's not necessarily saying that it's illegitimate. But we say even if it is illegitimate, even if it is the state's fault, right? We still have to look at the benefits we get from it. We tell you that the people who don't pass will still benefit because they get better policies overall, but also secondly because not politicians cater to them, and thirdly because the government catered to them and recognize there's a structural problem, not because they're just lazy, right? We can combat that narrative as well. That's what we want to do. That's what we
Before that,
second theme of policies, I'll actually take that view out before.
if you're telling us that the governments are going to inform their policies based off of people who are in structural places of oppression, if those people aren't voting and influencing the electorate, how can politicians cater policies to them?
Right, listen, if you were listening to my explanation, it's because now they can actually see, look, in area A, there's 80% who cannot vote. It means that there's a structural problem and we don't have the adequate education to actually help those people to surpass the bar. Right? You cannot do that under your side because you cannot know whether it's a structural problem or whether it's just simply because they're too lazy, right? We can combat that narrative. We've told you that. Now you have, as an individual, an incentive to come informed, right? But here they make the kind of weird thing that is say, well, people will still believe it's true like what Donald Trump says. Right, we think that the actor, we're not going to change, right? But we already told you that the people we are going to change is the ones who aren't necessarily really adamant on voting on some candidate, but the ones who actually don't really know the intrinsics and aren't going to look up what the EU is, right? We think that's the actor we win on. And we say even if they can take the test like 10 times, we think it's just inherently good that now they know what the EU is. And fine, if they then go vote for leaving the EU again, we're fine with that. So long they're still going to have it more informed. Furthermore, we told you a point that's really important that they kind of actually didn't respond to. We told you how we decrease populism, right, and populist parties. We said that this is extremely important, right, because under